All right, by my clock, it is 5:05 p.m., so we'll go and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us. Congressman, I see we're almost at 90 participants, so it's a great number, and we're excited to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. So for the folks who are listening in, Congressman Hurd has represented Texas's 23rd district since he was sworn in on January 6, 2015. He serves on both the prestigious House Appropriations Committee, which for those of you who don't know, is the money that's spent, the congressional committee that spends all of our money and puts it to good use. He's also on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. I had the honor of serving on the staff of for Chairman Mike Rogers, and he's the ranking member of the Intelligence Modernization and Readiness Subcommittee. He graduated from Texas A&M in May 2000 and reported immediately upon graduation to the farm, where he was trained as an undercover CIA officer. Over his nearly decade-long career with the CIA, the congressman served on the front lines of the war on terror, including deployments to India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. After leaving the CIA, Congressman Hurd built a successful business career in his home state of Texas, earning a partnership with Hank Crumpton's group, as well as becoming a founder. I didn't know this until I actually checked your bio, the cybersecurity firm FusionX, which I've done some work with. They are really superstars when it comes to identifying some of the core threats to computer networks. And so it's really an honor to be here with you, Congressman. You've had an amazing career, both in terms of national security and the like. You know, right now, obviously, folks on the phone know we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic. There are national security threats all around us. We see Iran staying aggressive in the Middle East. We see China as a growing power around the globe, and COVID and their early coming out of it may present a threat to us. Russia has been making moves for a long time in Eastern Europe and the like, and there's a possibility that they may look to do the same to distract their own population from the threat of COVID. But before we get to all that, we're going to talk about all that. We're going to talk about the digital version of COVID. I know we only have an hour, but it's going to be an action-packed hour. I do want to ask you. You know, you've had a pretty amazing and eclectic career from business to the CIA. How did you end up in Congress? What's the story? Did you always want to be in Congress when you were growing up, or what's the story there?
No, not at all. But the short answer is I got pissed, right, and ran. But so I ended up in the CIA. So my degree is in computer science, and that started because I had an internship in high school at a place called Southwest Research Institute. It's the largest private private research. And as a sophomore, the only technical skill I had was I could type 70 words a minute, right? And how I got that was great. I started focused on computer science at A&M, and then I took international studies as a minor, and I did that because up until the end of my freshman year in college, I had never been outside the United States of America. I had barely been outside of Texas, to be honest. And I was in my engineering department. I saw a sign that said, take two journalism classes in Mexico City for $425. Right. I had $450 in my bank account. So I go to Mexico, right?
Awesome.
Right.
Not the typical move for an engineering student.
No, it really was. Everyone was like, what? You're taking journalism classes? You know? And I loved it, and I had international studies.
Right.
When I took my first class, I had in international studies, I had this dude named Jim Olsen, complete and total CIA badass, right? Old school Cold Warrior. When he left the agency, he was the senior counterintelligence person in the agency. He's in this class telling all these stories, told these crazy stories of how when he was the deputy chief of station in Moscow, the Russians like killed his dog, you know, beat him up a couple of times. I was like fascinated by these stories, like, tell me more. And so that began my interest in the agency. Also, Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense, former head of the agency, was the interim head of the Bush School at Texas A&M when I was in school. He pushed me along. And so when I got out and finally got deployed, so I did 2 years in DC, 2 years in India, 2 years Pakistan, 2 years New York City doing interagency work, and then a year and a half in Afghanistan. You know, I was a dude collecting intelligence on threats to the homeland, recruiting spies, stealing secrets, but I had to brief members of Congress, right? And I probably briefed 200 RSDs, men, women, all 50 states. Unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to brief. I wasn't exposed to Mike Rogers. Unfortunately, I didn't meet people like Mac Thornberry or Pete Aguilar, right? Like, or Abigail Spanberger, she wasn't in Congress at the time. Like, I didn't have the chance to meet those awesome members. I met the ones that were shocking And I was shocked that they were making decisions for our country. And
at
I
each other's
thought they were
throats.
absolutely, absolutely. So I had friends that had run races before. They're like, have you ever thought about District 23? And I got upset. I always tell the story about when I was in Afghanistan, a bomb goes off. My unit was responsible. I had some members of HIPSI there in a briefing. They didn't know the difference between Islam, Sunnis and Shias. I got pissed. My mama said, you're the part of the problem, part of the solution. So I ran for Congress and lost. I lost that first race by 700 votes. But it gave me an opportunity to be in the private sector. It gave me an opportunity to really, really, truly understand cybersecurity. And now we're here. So long-winded answer to your question, Jamil. I apologize, but that's kind of how I decided to run for Congress. And when you get that close, losing a runoff election by 700 votes is not a lot of votes, especially when nobody thought I was going to win, and I won the first
close.
Yeah, it was super close. Yeah. And I called all my buddies. I didn't think I was going to run again because the guy that beat me went on to beat the incumbent, and I thought he was going to be in office forever.
Right.
But when he lost I called my friends and said, hey, I got one more in you. If y'all got one more in you, then I'm in. And they all said yes.
Amazing. Amazing. So, let's talk a little bit about your CIA background, then we'll talk about sort of COVID and the world we're in today. So, you joined the CIA right before the bombing of the USS Cole. You were there for what happened 9/11 and were deployed overseas after that. Talk to us about how those events and the crucible of being in the CIA, as a case officer running assets overseas, how did that change your career? I know you got upset and you decided to run for Congress, but how does that affect what you do today? You're on the intelligence committee, the same place you briefed people before. Now you're part of the solution. What does it look like now? What does it look like? We're obviously in a challenging political environment, also created in part by our enemies. Talk to us about how your time in the CIA shaped your view of what you're doing now.
So, I always talk about, so the day I left was, like you said, on the USS Cole. But I always talk about right before 9/11 in August. I was working, I had been working the Yemen account, and I was working closely with CTC, Counterterrorism Center, and the entire building was like, something's going to happen. Yeah. We don't know what it is. Something's going to happen. There was a tenseness, if that's a word. There was a concern. People were sleeping in their cars because they were sleeping on their desk, but people were like, you got to go home. So they just went and slept in their car because they were afraid. And so like this feeling that something was going to happen. And then when that second plane hit the Twin Towers, we knew it was Al-Qaeda, right? And so this concept of an intelligence failure, right? We're not connecting all the dots is something that I saw up close, right? In my congressional office, I have a picture. It's a print of a radar plot from December of 1947. It's the Opana radar station in Hawaii. Radar was first used, right, on the onset of World War II. And there were two radar guys that plotted the Japanese planes that came in and bombed Pearl Harbor. They thought it was people returning back to Hawaii. They turned that sucker off to go get breakfast, and like 8 minutes later, Pearl Harbor was bombed, right? I have that picture on my wall to remind me that part of this is, because of my experience and my background, making sure we get the barriers for intelligence sharing out of the way, making sure we're moving information so that we can keep people safe. So all these experiences have impacted, my perspective on these issues.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, there's no more sort of prescient moment than the idea that, having lived through that thing. I mean, people who, kids who are growing up now today don't even remember 9/11. They weren't alive during it. And I think for those of us who lived through it, it was such a crushing moment, with 3,000 dead in the course of minutes. And I think it's hard to explain to people who didn't live through it what that was like. And I can't imagine being at the CIA and having this instinct that something was going to happen, and then seeing it happen, and then being able to respond, though, and being able to take action and identify the people who are doing that threat, and keeping us safe for this last almost 2 decades now has been pretty amazing.
That's the point, right? Like, if you would have told me on September 12th, 2001, there was not going to be another major attack on the homeland for what, 19 freaking years, I would have been like, you're crazy. Okay, yeah. You're crazy. Right. But it's a testimony to federal law enforcement, our military, our diplomatic corps, and our intelligence services, right? And the other thing that's wild, people also don't remember, like, imagine if social media was what it is now back then, right? You had people driving to airports to pick up strangers and taking them somewhere, right? Like the support, the love for one another, the entire international community came together, right? Like, it was such a different experience. And then you juxtapose that against some of the responses, some of what we're seeing now with COVID-19. It's really wild. And if you look at 9/11 and you fast forward to December of 2001, that is when Kandahar fell. Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, the home base of the Taliban. That was basically, you know, at the end of December 2001, we killed 75% of Al-Qaeda leadership, pushed all of the Taliban out of the entire country, and there were 400 Americans on the ground, 300 special forces, 100 CIA. Now, you also had the greatest Air Force the world had ever seen.
Right. Dropping daisy cutters. That
was the invasion of Afghanistan, right? And so then you move back 19 years, like, why do we still have 20,000 troops there? Why are some of the districts, do you have, you know, even worse off than they were back then, right?
Why are we negotiating with the Taliban?
Oh, don't even get me started. That's a whole nother hour, right? So these are some of the things, like, having lived through that and being involved in it instantly. And I was like the 4th employee in CTCSO, Counterterrorism Center Special Operations Division. And I was a jack of all trades. I was a trainee, but I was doing all kinds of stuff. And that was the unit that prosecuted the war in Afghanistan. So it's just wild to think, one, I'm not old. That was that long ago.
You know, both.
Literally, my nephew called me. He's a sophomore in college, asking me about 9/11, and I'm just like, he's learning it as in the textbook. This is super weird.
Yeah. So let's talk about COVID-19, and I want to think about the lessons of living through 9/11 and our response to it. And frankly, let's be honest, the way we're walking back to that response now in the modern era, and we're changing the rules. We're in a lot of ways going back to the old pre-existing laws. I mean, FISA today, right, stands where it was pre 9/11 because of challenges on the Hill and in the administration. And we'll put that aside for a second. But what lessons can we take from what happened after 9/11? And the last 19 years for COVID. What does the threat look like to us today, both from COVID, but the spillover from COVID, all the dislocations it caused economically, the political dislocation it might cause? How should we be thinking about that particular challenge in this moment?
So I think first and foremost, we got to be strengthening our alliances, not weakening them, right? Because the only way we're going to solve this problem is by working with our allies. And we have to juxtapose this with the geopolitical struggle with China. I have an op-ed coming out tomorrow where I talk about how the Chinese are using this as an opportunity to further and to speed up their goal of surpassing the United States as a sole hegemon by 2049, when China celebrates 100 years of communist rule. So what are we doing? And so are we working with our allies at the WHO to put pressure on the WHO to get these questions? The Chinese have still not agreed to participate in sample sharing with the WHO, which is critical. The WHO hasn't mentioned, are you going to help, or are they going to ask China about some missing scientists that we haven't heard from about this, right? Are we going to address some of the racism against African countries? Like, these are some of the questions. That's one. Two, we see the Chinese looking to steal IP. We know the Chinese have been stealing IP, but they're starting to steal IP around the vaccine because they believe whoever gets to the vaccine first, super first mover advantage. So they're stealing information. But are we worried about being able to change some of that data, right? Everybody thinks of hacking as just theft of information, right? But manipulating the information is even more important, especially as we go to machine learning in artificial intelligence. So can we determine when our data sets have been corrupted? And what would that mean when it comes to a great American company looking for a vaccine for COVID-19, right? And we've seen the Iranians this week, yesterday, today, I forget when, potentially manipulate water infrastructure in Israel, right? So attack on a utility. We see the Chinese, as I said earlier, trying to collect more, steal information on the vaccine. So are we prepared, right, for the fire sale, right?
Right.
And again, I literally rewatched Die Hard 4, right? Where, an attack on transportation, financial services, and utilities. Everybody said that could never happen, right? But 6 months ago, people said there's no way a virus could bring the entire economy, the world economy, to a standstill. So are we ready for those things? And so are we going to be more resilient coming out of this? Nobody thought of TSA prior to 9/11, but we have TSA in there, and they're an important cog in making sure we're continuing to be safe. So what is that next thing, right? And for me, the lesson we should take, I feel like we were better off after 9/11. Intelligence sharing improved dramatically, very quickly. So in COVID-19, we talk about recovery, right? And to me, recovery means going back to a certain place we had been before. I want to talk about advancement. How do we move forward? How do we move forward, right? And that's where Congress and appropriators, and I'm trying to get them to think on, if we're doing federal dollars to states, local communities, and municipalities, how do we give money for them to harden their digital infrastructure, improve cybersecurity across all their platforms? How do you provide better digital-facing services, right, in order to be better off once we get through this? So, anyways, I went on a little rant. I apologize for that.
No, I mean, look, this is exactly right. I agree with almost everything you've said. And one of the things I want to ask about, and I know we were going to talk about this a little later, but I'd love to talk about it right now, which is, so what is the digital equivalent in your mind of COVID-19? So, you talked about this potential threat to water infrastructure, to energy infrastructure. What does that look like in this moment? Now that we've all sort of figured out that the craziest thing you could possibly imagine, working from home for 2.5 months and nobody getting out, nobody talking to anybody, everyone's social distancing, things you couldn't even imagine, not just in the US, but around the globe. What does that look like in the cyber arena? How real is it? Everyone always talks about a cyber 9/11 or a digital Pearl Harbor. What about the digital version of COVID-19? Is there such a thing, and what does that look like in your mind?
Yeah, so I don't know, right? But it's funny. I'm gonna get in trouble for mentioning. I watched a movie the other night. It's with Idris Elba. It was like from 2016, where he helped some guy, some American in Paris, and you had basically these folks were creating chaos and then doing something else, right?
Yeah.
So imagine if what happened to Estonia, what the Russians did to Estonia in 2009. If that happened while we were dealing with a major hurricane or dealing with COVID-19, right? So what happened to the Estonians, basically the Russians locked up all their systems and they couldn't even pay their employees, right? So do you do something that adds to the pandemonium that's already there? And then you do something like that close to an election in order to create additional chaos, right? Yeah. So it's that is kind of the concept. Like how does that happen, right? And so you have non-digital actions because of a digital activity, right?
Right.
And what specifically, man, I don't. It's hard for me to come up with what that is, but we know it's going to come around utilities. We know it's going to come around healthcare. We know it's going to come around transportation. We know it's going to come around financial services, right? And so how do we protect against those? And then I see somebody in one of the chats, someone's talking about AI, right? And data. iRobot. Isaac Asimov wrote that 70 years ago, 40 years ago.
Amazing.
A while ago, right? He wrote a long time ago. And the central theme, once you realize the Will Smith character from the movie is not in the book, right?
Right.
And you get past that.
Right.
The central theme there is they manipulated the data of the artificial intelligent beings, right? So are we prepared for that, right? Also, are our algorithms and machine learning, we're never going to have as much data as China.
Right. In part because they've stolen a
Chinese
lot of
don't
it.
care about civil liberties.
Right.
So our systems have to be based on things that don't have as much data. We're not going to beat them at their game. So how do we do that? And how do we use this crisis? And literally before this call, I'm working on a state and local modernization fund.
Right.
So can you give states and municipalities federal dollars for programs that already have some federal dollars to it? Let's take unemployment. We gave more money to unemployment insurance, but the Texas Workforce Commission in my home state couldn't meet the demand.
Right.
Right. They didn't even have a phone number for people to call. Right. So can you help them modernize? Can you help the pandemic response? Why are we still doing our shot records on yellow cards? Right?
Literally. My son's school. Unbelievable.
Are you kidding me? Right. And so can you have this fund, this X number of billions of dollars that go to those states so that they can improve their cybersecurity and increase digital facing services, right? Transition to cloud has to be cloud first, right?
Right.
Because once you get cloud first and you get the data in that format, then you can start talking about all the AI tools and machine learning on top of that. But the data has to be in the right format. So that's where I think, and I'm trying to get some of my colleagues to think that way. I think it's called the Cybersecurity Solarium or Cyberspace Solarium.
Cyberspace Solarium, yeah.
Right, the report that came out there saying, hey, more money for state and local on cybersecurity. So the concept is there, and I'm trying to work out the how, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one way that we can mix these things.
Yeah. So, I know that you're working on an AI plan with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Tell us about that. What's the story that we know about the amazing work you did on quantum to get funding for that leap ahead technology that's really going to be at the heart of both being able to break codes, but also and be able to sort of advance our computing, but also the ability to secure our own infrastructure with these quantum capabilities, both through quantum key distribution and quantum computing. Talk to us about what you're thinking on AI, what the story there is. I know a lot of it's about data.
Sure.
What should we be thinking about AI in particular?
Sure.
And is there any relation between that and the COVID-19 situation we're in right now? And by the way, before you answer, I just want to mention to people, we are going to take questions. So in about 10, 15 minutes, we'll go to audience questions. Please be thinking of your questions, put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A section, and we'll get over to them, as many of them as we can. So talk to us about the AI plan that you're working on with BP.
Sure. So the concept is, look, I think there's like 25 nations that have a national strategy on AI. I think the folks at the White House, Michael Kratsios, and why am I'm drawing a blank here? The woman who really runs the program. I think they've done yeoman's work on this. But let's codify something in the law, because I want to make sure this survives any administration. I think the previous administration has done some work on advancing AI and quantum and all these advanced technology. I think this administration has done a good job. And so how do we think about how do we harmonize dollars for research, right? And what private sector research is going on, but also what's happening at our labs. How do we ensure that the federal government adopts artificial intelligence tools in order to do their jobs better, right? We talk about waste, fraud, and abuse in some of our entitlement programs. Are we using AI in order to do that? If you talk to the head of NGA, the National Geospatial Agency, it would work for him to hire enough analysts to look at just the moving video that they have in there that they already have access to. They would have to hire like 1 million people, right? So what tools are we using, within that NGA space? So how do we put all these things together? But also, how do we think about regulation in a way that we're not stifling innovation? And it's some simple ideas. When it comes to civil rights and civil liberties, we already have laws, right?
Yeah.
Those laws apply to algorithms just the way they apply to people, right? And we don't need some AI department. We need the folks at the Office of Civil Rights within HHS to understand how data and artificial intelligence can be used in health to make sure those algorithms are not being biased. We need people at Hurd, to make sure that when housing applications and money for and programs for affordable housing, that it's not being biased, right?
Right.
Like
No redlining. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. So can Congress? So every year, every Congress, the committees have an oversight plan. That oversight plan talks about what hearings are you going to have, the questions you're going to ask, and we should be asking these regulators, how are they looking at some of these new tools? How are also those entities introducing some of those tools into their workspace, right? And so part of what Robin Kelly, Robin and I have done so much together, Democrat from Illinois. We're working on, can we put together a set of recommendations on these areas and get them into the congressional record and pass them? Do we put them all together as a resolution to put us on Congress on record? Do we cut them up and do to the relevant committees? One of the problems you have with something that's expansive is the word that I learned my first week in Congress, and I hate: jurisdiction.
Right.
And so can we narrow some of these things in one jurisdiction to pass this? So this is what we're doing with BPC. And we have, a lot of Lynn Parker. Thank you. Lynn Parker she is a national treasure over at the White House. And so these are the folks that, these are the kind of things that we're trying to do. And we're going to be rolling out some of the papers and some of our findings in the next few weeks.
Awesome. So folks, we are going to go to questions here in about 9 minutes. But before we do, so talk to me about, getting the economy restarted. We're talking about getting the economy restarted. At some point, we're all going to start going back to work or in some different form, whatever it might be. But, we really need Congress to do things that benefit real Americans out there, right? And one of the things that you and I talked about as we were preparing for this call was this idea of, sort of the 21st version of the rural electrification project, right? And what that looks like, right? What is, we know people always talk about the digital divide, right? And between the haves, the have-nots. And, we know that a lot of kids today are learning on, online, but not everybody has access to that. Not everyone has access to broadband, right? How do we think about sort of what's the rural electrification plan or the interstate highway system of the 21st century, and particularly in the post-COVID era where we're going to need to jumpstart the economy, right? What does that look like?
Sure. So I talked with a charter school in New York, and across all their schools, they have 98% participation in their online classes every day.
Amazing.
That's crazy, okay? And in some of the teachers, instead of having 30 kids, he or she has like 120 kids, right? Like they've adjusted their tactics, techniques, and procedures to this environment, right? I've talked to some of the superintendents in my district. 3% involvement of their kids doing what their digital participation, right? So it's crazy. And so when it comes to the digital divide between urban and rural spaces, first off, we have to map those rural places that don't have access. Right. Like it starts with that. Where are we going to go? Then we have to look at any kind of transportation project, right? Because I look at my district, I-10, right? I-10 runs through a good part of the district. I don't have cell phone. I literally don't have cell phone service in a third of my district, right? But dig once, okay? If you're doing a road, lay the damn fiber, okay? Right. Not hard. Even if you don't have someone that can take advantage of that to provide that service, let's figure out how we get to, and then we worry about the last mile problem after the fact, right?
Exactly.
How do we connect to libraries in some of these communities where kids are able to go? So first off, we have to map where the lack of access actually is. Right. Then we have to rethink how some of these fees that we're already paying within telecommunications, how they're being used appropriately to expand that access. And then
we're still buying landlines. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other issue is, look, this is this state and local technology modernization fund I'm working on. If the city of San Antonio want to use some of these funds to build the infrastructure for 5G in communities within San Antonio and Bexar County, where San Antonio is, and a provider is willing to provide access out there, then let's do that, right? Could the school, right? So the schools have some of these resources where they are, in essence, providing free Wi-Fi to those students in that area, and that money is helping to make sure that the provision is going there, and you're not going to hit, you're not going to be able to go steal the Wi-Fi because you got to be employed in that school, right? So we have to leverage everybody within this stack in order to get that information out there, but it starts with where are those holes? And to be frank, I know it from anecdotal evidence from driving around, but no one's ever provided me with a map.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And, you think about it, it's not like we can't do this in rural America. I mean, even in a city like Chattanooga, right? My old boss, Bob Corker, he helped create make Chattanooga the gig city because they decided as a corporate matter, it was the right thing to do. And the beauty of sort of that's the internet, as we're all learning, learning and teaching and working online, is that if you can bring this capability, broadband access to homes, you don't have to give up the quality of life in a rural community, right? And the benefits you gain from having that community, you don't have to go live in an urban center. You can have the economic opportunities right there in your community if we bring you the capability. But, we just haven't thought about that corporately. And it's amazing to hear that you're thinking about that.
Sure. But look, there's other little things that have been a problem pre-COVID-19, right? Yeah. Let's take 5G. With 5G, you need more antennas per area, right? And so what some of these cities and counties were trying to do, they were trying to nickel and dime folks that are building infrastructure because they saw this as a quick way to get money, rather than how can we speed up an opportunity to give a service to our community that our communities need, right? And so you had some of those barriers that were happening because they're trying to use this as a money-making opportunity.
Well, and what's crazy about that is, think about it, you're nickel and diming the providers to put these antennas without looking at the dramatic economic expansion you can gain and the tax base you can gain from that, where you're going to make long-term revenue as opposed to short-term, small amounts on these poles and the like. It just It seems crazy. So let's go back to COVID for a minute and think about, you mentioned earlier on, privacy and these issues in cyberspace. We know that Google and Apple are thinking about helping with contact tracing, right? A lot of people are concerned about privacy issues. We know the debate that's going on in Congress about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, in part because of, challenges at the FBI. How should we be thinking about privacy when it comes to some of these valuable things like contact tracing? And how do we reconcile, things that are common goods? Privacy is a common good. It's right at the heart of our ethos as a nation, right? We came out as a nation that was rebelling against an overweening king who wanted to be in our homes and the like, and the American people don't want that. How do we think about privacy, but also supporting positive things like contact tracing and ensuring that our communities are safe?
Right. Well, look, I think part of it is, I think there's so many phrases that have become part of our normal vernacular now, like contact tracing, but knowing that that's a tool that's going to help you if you don't have it, right? Because you'll get notified if you were around someone that potentially did have it, right? Right. And so it's not just like I actually think the way you can anonymize this information and what Apple and Google is trying to do to anonymize it, like I think that you can achieve the anonymization of that and protect that information, right? I think you can do that. The next question is, okay, if you get to a point, let's say the research does come out and say that if you have the antibodies, right? Let's say you had COVID, you had the antibodies, and that antibodies makes you resilient for X number of months.
Right.
And you get this free hall pass. How are you going to communicate that? And let's say the airlines say you have to have a notification of this. How do you get that information to the airline, right? And how do you do that in a way that ensures that I want to be able to use a good or service, but I have to prove something, that right. relates to my health, right? These are some of the debates that we're going to have. How do you ensure, so last night, San Antonio went to, anybody can get a diagnostic test for COVID-19, right? Right. You don't have to have one of the symptoms. We have a glut we have an overcapacity for testing, right? So how do you, so why are we having problems? And it shouldn't be hard for when this gets tested, I should be able to get a notification on my phone of my response to my test, right? And that starts with this concept that information is mine and I own it, right?
Right.
And I'm asking you to give it to me. And once you give it to me, you clear it. And then is there a clearinghouse that we have to have? Like these are complicated questions. And we have to say, okay, this is what we're willing to accept.
Yep.
This is what we're not. And then that's where we're going to go. And if you look at, everyone wants to use South Korea as an example of the aggressive contact tracing that they're able to do. There are examples out there that we can use.
Yeah, no. So Will, we're going to go to questions from the audience.
Sure.
Congressman, thank you for doing that. But before we do, I do want to ask one last question, even though I know we're at the 20-minute mark. So sadly for all of us, you're leaving Congress at the end of this session. Talk to us about, for just a minute or two, about your plans for the future, to the extent you want to get into it. Tell us what you're thinking. What are your ideas? Actually, that's a question from the audience too. So talk to us about what you're thinking about.
Sure. When I left the CIA, people thought I was crazy because look, I was having a good career. It was a job I love, a job I was good at. But I left it because I thought I could help the intelligence community in a different way, right? And I also, leaving Congress, I think I could help the country in a different way. I believe these jobs are not designed for you to be in them forever. I've gotten I think I'm at 15 or 16 pieces of legislation signed into law, and that's in 5.5 years. That's more legislation than most people do in over a couple of decades career. And so I've been effective. I'm 42 years old. And so when I look at artificial intelligence and quantum and 5G, where is some of the most interesting stuff happening on that? It's not in the government. It's in the private sector, right? Yeah. So to be able, I'll do something in the private sector at this intersection of national security and technology. I can't finalize anything until I'm out of Congress. Right. But I know that's kind of one of the buckets. Yeah. I'll do something in the media, right? Where I keep talking about the things I care about, right? I probably turn down more media than I accept because I want to talk about national security. That's my background. That's my passion. I'll keep doing those kinds of things. Third, I'm going to probably be working with an institution in San Antonio to develop a institute on technology and policy. Yes, we need more cyber warriors, but we also need more smart, staffers at the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Homeland Security Committee and FCC and FEC and FTC. So can you get, whether you're a political science major that minors in informatics, right? Or you're a computer science major that has a minor in international studies, we're going to work with you and help you get a badass, internship at Homeland Security or OGR on the Hill. And then, right. And the next summer, it's going to be at AWS or Microsoft or something like that, right? So we're building a cadre of people that have some technical understanding, but also some policy understanding that can help us make sure that we're taking advantage of technology before technology takes advantage of us.
That's great. That's great.
And then politically, I'm staying involved too, right? Politically, I have an organization that I'm helping candidates to make sure the Republican Party looks like America.
Love it. Love it. So I want to go to questions from the audience. One of our audience members asked, how do we ensure the security of devices made overseas? We know there's been this big debate about Huawei and ZTE and Chinese products and the like. It's heated up with the questions about our supply chain and COVID and PPE and test kits and the like. How do we think about this problem, the security devices made overseas?
Well, I think it starts with thinking about changing global supply chains, right? We just passed USMCA. We're supposed to be implementing it next month. All right, so how do we think about North American competitiveness, and how can some of those supply chains that move to China, how can we move them to Mexico, to Canada, doing things in Vietnam with some of our allies? So first, starting about how do you create incentives so those global supply chains move? I think that's one piece. Two, when it comes to 5G specifically, you got to provide a better alternative. the many Europeans believe, they're like, look, okay, Chinese own the infrastructure, but we're good enough that we can protect ourselves going along that infrastructure where they're not going to be able to bump us off.
Right.
Okay, maybe they do have the technical expertise to do that, but Huawei is cheaper. Huawei is just as good as a lot of these other providers. So how do we help Samsung, Nokia, and build them as an alternative? And how are we looking at all of the tools of national power to help? Like, why aren't we going to our allies and say, listen, we're going to have an OPIC loan, right? And OPIC has a new name now, the Overseas. It's an infrastructure.
Right. The new name.
It's our version of One Belt, One Road, right? How do we have that? How do we work with U.S. aid, programs? How do we have the homeland funding that's going like? Why are we not coming in with an entire package?
Right.
And say, oh, and by the way, maybe you do a 10-year deal with Samsung, right? And then that helps a company that are already dealing with 5G be able to have the long-term projection on their income in order to compete with a state-sponsored entity like Huawei, right? So it's changing how we look at, can we change supply chains? And then if it comes to something that's being introduced into sensitive parts of the federal government, we got to know what the vulnerabilities are. Right.
We got to run that down.
That's simple.
So, one of the things that we're doing on this front, on the cybersecurity front, NSA has been talking a lot about, and CyberCam has been talking a lot about this idea of defend forward and persistent engagement, something you've been involved in at the House Intelligence Committee. Don Dixon, who runs Forge Point Capital, one of our NSI advisory board members, the biggest cybersecurity fund out there, asked the question, how is defend forward working? Is it effective? Are we able to be successful in that space? What's your thinking on defend forward, persistent engagement? And particularly as we look at the elections and we know the Russians are going to get involved, the Chinese may get involved. How do we think about defend forward?
So I think General Nakasone probably is the person that articulates this the best, right? There has to be consequences to negative behavior, right? And so if you don't provide consequences, that behavior is going to continue.
Called deterrence. Imagine that.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and you can use a recent example of the Iranians, right? It's funny, we all forget the guy's name now, right? But the former head of IRGC, his replacement is not as active as his predecessor was.
Because you learn, you get whacked. You're like Hassan Soleimani, you get whacked.
Right. And so the question is, in the cyberspace, right? It's what are you saying? Like establishing red lines, right? Now the problem in cyberspace, when you establish a red line, I can literally get 1 pixel
away
in front of that red line and not cross it. And that's why you still need some ambiguity to say, if these kinds of things happen, we will respond. We're not going to say what the response maybe is. I actually believe the separation of NSA and Cyber Command is a good thing, because here's why. NSA is an intelligence organization. Cyber Command is an action arm. The action arm is always going to action information they receive. An intelligence agency always wants to protect the information they receive. If you action intelligence, you're going to oftentimes lose that intelligence. So that natural tension has always been there in the intelligence and the operational space.
Yeah. Intel gain loss, right?
Absolutely. And so I think that separation, and then you have other entities make that choice on when the action is more important than the loss of intelligence, right? And so I think that is why I think we've been able to see some of these efforts take place. And I think the next step is, one of the issues I always had in the previous administration is we would never name and shame, right? And in some cases, I don't need, attribution, direct attribution. I don't need to say it was Colonel Oleg from the SVR that did that.
Right.
Just being able to say the SVR did this thing, right?
That's enough.
And here's our response, right? And so I think this administration has done a good job with that attribution, but also when it comes to when we do something aggressive or offensively, and letting people know we did it.
Yeah, I mean, what's amazing about attribution is, I think that we tend to have this hiccup that because it's zeros and ones, we need perfect attribution. The reality is that we've never needed that in the real world. We've taken action against plenty of people where we knew it was that guy over there. We can go take action. We don't need the dots and the pixels exactly right to know that's what happened. Right. So one of the things you talked about was this idea of, theft of the vaccine research and the like. And you just mentioned, that there's these, that we don't know where the red lines are. You might get one pixel away. One question that Sunil used to be at Bank of America, now doing a lot of thinking and writing a book on these topics, and actually introduced me to this idea of being anti-fragile that Nassim Taleb brought about, which I think is a concept you were just talking about recently. What is the line between cyber warfare? Like what is caused this sort of cyber war, right? How do we create that policy, and how do we figure out what that red line ought to be? Sure. And we need strategic ambiguity for sure, but like how do we even get a ballpark sense of what that red line is? Is it physical effects? Is it the grid going out? Where's that line? We know some things that are obvious.
Right. Well, let's start with the obvious, right? Let's start with how the UN defines an act of war, right? And the UN defines an act of war of manipulating or destructing, doing something destructive to utilities as an act of war, right? So the Iranians manipulating a utility in Israel is actually based on their definitions an act of war, right? And so let's start with the things that we can all agree on, right?
Right.
Yeah, the easy stuff. Because I could say, look, if Kim Jong-un launched a nuclear missile into San Francisco,
not hard.
We all know what our response is going to be. Kim Jong-un knows what the response is going to be. That physical on physical is easy, right?
And it's why he doesn't do it. It's why the Russians don't do it. It's why the people who have nuclear don't do it. It's easy.
So I think it starts with what is a digital, like start with what the UN considers an act of war, and then go from there.
Right.
I think the Talon manual, which is kind of what's used within military space,
right,
as one of those good examples of what digital warfare is. I think that's something that's additional information that we can do. But for I've been in conversations for probably the last decade talking about what a digital act of war is. Right. I'm still not better off now on what to explain it. But these are some of the questions, and this is also why we need smart people that understand the technology, and the policy at the same time to articulate that.
Yeah. So Jason Casey is one of our visiting fellows at NSI. Says, look, your peers didn't understand the difference between Sunni and Shia. Can we really trust them to figure out quantum and AI? And I mean, should we have a rule that you can't run for Congress unless you have some sort of tech savvy? Like, how do we ensure that members of Congress and their staffs are up to speed on this stuff? Because I mean, this stuff is not easy. I mean, Sunni Shia, all right, we can all figure that out. I mean, it's easier for me, right? But like, what AI, cyber? I mean, these are not simple things. Quantum computing.
Right. Well, especially what was the number of hearings where people are like, so if my photos are in the cloud, how do I get my photos? It's like, oh my God,
No, the Facebook hearings are just astounding. Yeah.
Right. And we talk about the cloud as being emerging technology. I'm like, guys, it's emerged. Okay, this is not new. Okay, so all joking aside, what I will say is, I have been pleasantly surprised at how so many of my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, understand the importance of cybersecurity and come and ask questions, right? Yeah. Like I get a lot of questions asked of me, and so they understand it's important. Now, are they going to be able to talk about, how a quantum bit can be a 1, 0, both, and neither, or all the above at the same time, and how that increases the power, and talk about superposition and all that? No, but I actually don't think they need to do that, right? If they think about artificial intelligence as a tool, and rather than a destination, they will be able to pass this. But what members of Congress are prepared to do is talk about how do we, the principles that make our country great, how do we adapt them into the future, right? I think Congress is well equipped to debate the ethics issue around, can a robot kill a robot, or can a robot kill a human?
Right.
Where does that human need to be involved in that chain, right? And so I think those are some of the issues that they can be prepared. However, I would agree. We need people. This is why, every organization, every department has some fellow in Congress, right?
Right.
Right now, I have a fellow from the State Department in my office. We need to be having more fellows that have a technical understanding to help, especially for members that are major leaders on these topics, right?
Yeah.
And that's where creating some of that partnership with the private sector to help educate some of those members.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's interesting. One of our technologist fellows, which are exactly what you described, technologists who we bring in to teach about policy and try to get them involved with Congress, Shazza Jabani, and actually, it's another question that other people have asked also, is when we think about creating access to rural communities, right? Sometimes those economic incentives don't align, right? And how do we think about getting Congress to help those economic incentives align, or at least make it more sensible for companies to invest in this space? Can we reduce regulation in a way that allows deployment of technology to rural spaces and the like?
Yeah. Look, I think the broad-based problem on how you solve rural issues is the government provides the infrastructure, and then it's to deliver those bits to a rural community is the same as delivering it to an urban center. San Antonio is the seventh largest city in the country, right?
Right.
So can we take that infrastructure and COVID-19 has made it clear. Infrastructure is no longer bridges, roads, locks, and dams, right? It's also digital infrastructure as well. So that's the broader concept in saying, hey, we're going to do it. We're going to move on this because it's necessary. And I see it every day. There's more cows than people in the middle part of my district. So that's the broader concept of where we ultimately need to go. And you already have some of those fees that we're already paying on telecommunications that we need to now rethink. And is the way that fee is being spent now, has it outlived its usefulness? And should we direct it to other places?
Yeah. So, folks, we are going to end right on time at 6 o'clock. I want to respect everybody's time and the congressman's time. So we have about 3 minutes. I'm going to try to get through as many questions as possible. Yeah. So Sydney Sakota,
it's the lightning round. I will not be as loquacious.
There you go. Well, so Sydney Sakota asks about when we're expanding, infrastructure, urban areas. We've obviously seen a huge uptick in people working from home and the like. Should we be concerned about security issues? What should we be thinking about in terms of security when it comes to expanding to urban areas, expanding to a lot more in-home working, teleworking, and the like? Is there a concern there? And if so, what should we be doing about that? And how do we think about the public-private divide when it comes to cybersecurity? We've got nation state attacking us, right? But we're not defending as a nation. We're defending as individual companies. Is that sensible? And if not, how do we solve that problem or address that problem?
I think Keith Alexander has the best example. If the private sector thinks they can defend themselves by themselves, or the government can defend themselves by themselves, it's the equivalent of the French thinking the Maginot Line is going to defend them from the Germans. We have to work together. But it also comes to some basic literacy, right? We know from when we were kids, don't get into a car with a stranger. Asterisks, unless it's Uber or Lyft. Right?
By the way, crazy.
Right? But you're going to click on email from people you don't know, right? Come on. And so some of this is some really basic cultural things that spammers and people doing social engineering, that stuff is still increasing. So there's some basic, etiquette that we have to continue to promote. Where in school do you learn about those kind of things? Where in school do you learn about how to create a strong password, right? And so the way you defend digital infrastructure in a rural area is the same way you defend it in an urban area, right? And that can be scalable, but you have to educate people on how to use these tools in a smart way.
Totally. All right.
That wasn't much of a lightning round answer.
No, well, that's great. So our last question is from Devika Daga. She asks about the fact there are a lot of technologies serving in government and the like. The problem is institutions like Congress don't know what to do with those people, right? How do we solve that problem? How do we get members of Congress up to speed on how to solve those people, how to deal with those people and use them effectively?
Well, I think it starts with directing. So people that are smart on these issues, you got to start in those offices of people that already know a little something, right? You know, since I work on all these issues a lot already, I would know how to put someone at use. But I would love to see a technologist, you know, at the Oversight and Government Reform Committee or whatever the new name is, on the group that still does technology, and be in those right committees to help do those oversight plans, right?
Right.
And so making sure they're in before the start of a new Congress so they can help with, hey, here are the questions we should be asking over the year, and here's why, and here's some of the people that we can be dragging in. So they have to be placed in the right subcommittees in order to be useful, because they're a scarce quantity. So start with the right committees and then the individuals that actually talk about this stuff.
Got it. Well, listen, Congressman, thank you so much for coming. It's been an awesome conversation. We'll have to have you back. We've got 22 questions we didn't get to, and I apologize to the folks who asked those questions I didn't get to you. We are right at 6 o'clock, so we're going to stop. But listen, folks, join us for the next session of this. We're going to have Jim Clapper. It'll be definitely a different perspective in 2 weeks from now. So please tune in to NatSec Nightcap. Congressman, it's been awesome. Thank you so much. Look forward to continuing to work with you. This is awesome.
My pleasure. Thanks for what you do, Jamil. Your friendship's been great. And for those, if you're not following me, Hurd on the Hill, whichever your social media platform is, because we got a few things coming. So thanks, brother.
Thank you. Appreciate it, sir. Thanks, everybody. Good night.